Hello and welcome back to TickerTalks. Together with Polaron Language Services, we are looking to use language to connect communities. And whilst Polaron is the sponsor of our program, all the views and opinions in the following segment are of course our own. But first I would like to acknowledge that this segment is being held on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and I pay my respect to elders both past, present and future of course. I am joined by Director of Polaron Language Services, Eva Hussein. How are you today?
Pretty good, Mike. How are you?
Doing well. Despite lockdown, we managed to soldier on. But what's been happening at Polaron this week?
Lots of very interesting things, lots of work coming our way because of what's happening in Melbourne. And on the screen, you will shortly see one of our projects that we've recently done. And when I say recently, it wasn't that recently, actually, that was a few years ago, where we've worked on multilingual appointment cards. So these are used by all kinds of professionals, so including doctors and nurses, so they might, for example, see a patient or, a client, and they print off these appointments cards. They generated through a website of a New South Wales refugee organisation, and print them off, give them to their patients, clients, etc., so that they understand what their appointment's for, what time and where. And since these cards were introduced, the rates of people attending appointments that may not have English as their native language has increased dramatically. So it's just one way of a clever solution, which is a simple solution, by the way, of enabling refugee communities to participate more in Australian life, I guess.
And that's incredibly important, especially in the health sector, if you need to see someone for an appointment or a physician, etc. But why don't we touch on miscommunication of the week? What have you seen out there at the moment?
I don't want to pick on a particular organisation. This is not about that.
Okay.
But what I want to pick on, Mike, today is logic of translation. So for anybody that does any translations at all, you should think about how that information is presented. So this particular one, and we won't mention which bank this is, by the way, talks about how to work with interpreters and who interpreters are. And virtually every single bit of information on that slide was incorrect. Right. In that interpreters are, you shouldn't work with family members or staff members, they're professionals. But also what you are seeing there, this information was actually placed on page 16 of a guide for, people who may want to work with that particular institution. If you do not read English or if you do not speak English, what chance do you have of actually getting to page 16 and finding that information? So what I am trying to say today to everybody that's listening, that if you are producing information for people who may not speak English as their first language, think about how they're going to actually see it, where are they going to see it. It is much better to put that interpreter symbol on the first page so people can actually open it. Again, they have no hope of finding information that's on page 16 or 30. So think about how that information that you will translate or produce will actually reach the community.
There's documents out there that even I struggle to understand as an English-speaking person, and so I can only imagine what it's like when it comes to paperwork as someone in the multicultural community. So I'm glad you brought that one up. But this week we're discussing refugees, and in the past decade, the number of people displaced from their homes has almost doubled, from 41 million to 79.5 million, whilst millions of refugees and displaced persons have settled in Australia since 1945. We've seen many controversies surround refugee settlement. Today we're shining a light on the barriers refugees and asylum seekers face in Australia and how organisations can better support them. And Eva, as a former refugee, you're obviously very passionate about this topic. So let's bring in our guests for today. And Pagonis worked for 4 decades in government with a focus on migrant and refugee settlement and multicultural affairs, and now volunteers for not-for-profits including ECCV and Welcoming Cities. And our other guest, Simic, came to us from Australia as a refugee at the age of 11 and has since worked as a campaigner at every level from grassroots community, I should say, and now organising for federal parliamentarian for NGOs and as elected representatives. Gentlemen, ladies, everyone in between, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Now, I wanted to dive right in, and Con, this is a very basic question, but let's get us all across the same page because I understand there's some misunderstanding here. What is the difference between a migrant, asylum seeker, and a refugee? Could you run us through that?
Well, just briefly, I suppose the main differences are a migrant. A migrant is somebody who's been accepted under Australia's migration program and has been visaed and arrives with a permanent residence status. An asylum seeker is somebody who seeks entry to a country such as Australia through recognition of their refugee status, which they are still seeking. And a refugee is somebody who's actually recognised as a refugee through, I suppose, accreditation, for want of a better word, through an international organisation such as UNHCR or IOM. Eva, I suppose, is there anything you'd like to add to that to clarify further?
Eva or Oggy?
I think that is a very good description, and I think some people immigrate to Australia as students. The pathways of becoming an immigrant. There's various of them. Yeah, very many.
But that was a really good rundown. Oggy, I'll go to you. And Australia has seen a long history of accepting refugees for resettlement. Millions of refugees or displaced persons have settled in Australia. So why is this something that is a big part of what your work and why you're passionate about trying to fix or solve? What's the problem?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. This year actually marks 20 years of the Tampa moment, which I think was a significant point in change in policy and approach in Australia. What we've seen since then is that in the lead up to elections, major political parties have used refugees to drive up hysteria. This week, actually 8 years since that moment, where former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd announced people seeking asylum in Australia by boat would be processed off and prevented from settling in Australia. I still remember what I was doing on that day. I was absolutely speechless. But since then, I thought that was as bad as it could get. Consecutive governments have continued that race to the bottom. We've seen further watering down of the Migration Act. We've seen refugees being used as political footballs. In fact, since 2013, 3,127 people who've come to Australia for protection have been subjected to offshore processing and are still suffering under failed, arbitrary and harmful policies.
You've highlighted some really important points there. And Con, I'll direct the question to you now about the controversial nature of this topic, still today in 2021.
Yes, I think Oggy's absolutely right. I would cite August 2001 as the key turning point in a change of direction in public opinion towards refugees. From 1945, when the Immigration Department was first established, right through for 40, 50 years, the key to success in garnering public support for the refugee program was bipartisanship. We embarked in 1945 on a massive nation-building exercise, bringing in large numbers of migrants and refugees. Of course, there were always going to be elements in the Australian community that pushed back against newcomers. But what helped us get through any public unease about large-scale migration and in particular refugees was bipartisan leadership at the political level. That changed in the 1990s, particularly with the rise of Hansonism, and then with the Tampa episode in August 2001, the refugee program was politicised and has since then become a political football. And to some extent, to a large extent, both sides of politics have to bear some responsibility for that politicisation that has resulted in refugees becoming a controversial issue.
It's absolutely incredible to unpack with you guys, and so thank you again for coming on the program. I want to touch on how many refugees go through the incredible trauma before arriving in Australia. Can we touch on the issues that they face once they arrive here, once they arrive in a place that they think they're going to find refuge, and how often it's worse? I'll open the floor.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first, if you like, Mike. I think the circumstances for every pen can be different. I was 11 years old when I came to Australia. That was in 1998. And my circumstances are different to the experiences that people are having arriving in Australia now. I think got much worse and harsher. That's reflected in the to people seeking asylum. We are seeing that people come to Australia with significant challenges. Obviously, leaving your home is something that nobody wants to do.
I'll just go to Con on the same question about how the arriving here and actually having more traumatic experiences can affect these multicultural communities and refugees.
Yes, I think I agree with Ogie. It's difficult to generalise. I think everybody's got their own journey, their own story, and their own circumstances. So it is difficult to generalise. But I think there are critical issues that impede the ability of newly arrived refugees who've been through traumatic circumstances on their journey to Australia, that can impede their settlement and their successful settlement in Australia and their participation in the community. I think, and it's quite topical, I think probably one of the big things that impacts adversely on the capacity of new arrivals to settle successfully is racism. And again, I go back to my previous answer. A lot of that can be directed back to the lack of leadership, particularly at the federal government level. Here we are in 2021, and it's been 10 years or more before there's been an energised national strategy to address racism. And it's a major failing of our political leadership. So there are a range of things. There are a range of things that will continue to traumatise refugees post-arrival. But I think if you're asking me to single out one, I would say the experience of racism. And just finally on that point, Vic Health in Victoria, the Victorian Health Foundation, has undertaken research about 10 years ago and specifically identified the experience of racism and the fact that it leads to depression and compounds the difficulty of settlement for new arrivals.
It's truly damaging for everyone across all, things like that, across the board is what I wanted to say. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Eva, just one question for you before we get you to sum up. And how do you think organisations might improve their communication with refugee committees, being the director of Polaron? I just thought I'd ask you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, all I have to say to that is logic. Use your logic. Don't translate things that people cannot understand because they may not be able to read or write. Don't put things on page 16 or 33 of your document if you want to really truly reach communities, and just find out who you want to talk to. So it should never be a one-sided conversation. If there is a particular community, and we all diverse, we all different, so you can't have a cookie-cutter solution to it all. Talk to the people that you want to talk to, and that's the best way. And I know we're in lockdown, but there are ways, people can still get on Zoom and there's social media. There's all kinds of very creative ways that you can reach your communities, but don't assume and don't judge and don't be racist is my message.
Yeah. It's an ongoing discussion. I'd like to thank all of you for joining me on the program today. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but we'll have to bring you back in a couple of weeks and see where everyone's at. This was just a very important one, I think. So thank you, Eva, for bringing these guys along.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you.
And guys, if you've got any questions about how to reach your multicultural audiences, get in touch with the team at Polaron. Contact details are on the screen, and that's it for TickerTalks today. I'm Mike Loader, and I look forward to discussing things next time we meet. Be well.